So happy to be with you all tonight, and really thank you to the Young Professionals Group for inviting us. We're talking about a tricky topic, which is how do we communicate about what it really takes to change the world, and how can we kind of alter some of the narratives that have been built up that are actually damaging to folks. But before I begin, I just want to also share a little bit about Thousand Currents for anybody who might not know. So next slide, please. So our partners take on big corporations to keep their communities safe from environmental hazards. They build women-owned cooperatives that hold millions of dollars in assets. They save local seeds and promote indigenous farming practices to sustain people and the land. Our partners are doing amazing things. They do all the work and we provide the funding. And most importantly, we stick with them through their change and evolution, because a basic premise for us at Thousand Currents is that lasting change takes time. It's not linear, it's not predictable, and it really requires a lot of effort at multiple levels. Next slide, please. So there's something else we do, and that's what's related to what we're talking about tonight. We also want to really dismantle, we really believe that dismantling injustice and inequality requires us to make waves in philanthropy, which is a product of inequality, and really even disrupt the narratives that derive it. Next slide. So who am I? I'm the Director of Communications. You've heard my bio, but I think the thing that I want to visibilize about my own journey thus far is that while I started as a volunteerist before that was even a word, and I had a lot of shame about that for a long time, but we have moved on, folks. And I worked for international NGOs, as you heard, and now I'm with Thousand Currents for 4 years. And I'm so happy I'm here, because at the end of the day, I think I'm finally with an organization that understands communication is a strategic part of ensuring that we achieve our mission. And I think that's why all of you are here, because you, in whatever realm you find yourselves, also care about that. So I just want to thank you all for being here. Next slide. So what do I do all day? As a Director of Communications, I'm looking for that sweet spot where our message gets across, we're reaching our key audiences, and we're getting into the platforms or publications or the things that we really want to be seen. And there's a lot of tricky parts to that, because next slide, please. This is what other people are doing all day, right? There's like so many things vying for people's attentions. We actually refer to the attention wars these days. So standing out and delivering striking messages and messages that are relevant to our work is this really, it's a balancing act. And so it's a significant challenge for us as an organization to describe social change in ways using words and images that compete with all of that information that's coming at us all the time. At the same time, we're here talking about communications because there is a growing recognition that no matter what sector you work in, no matter what job you have, really painting the fuller picture of people's lives, in this big changing world is really becoming part of everyone's job. So that balancing act, next slide, please. We're really, as a Director of Communications, you're sitting in between in between a lot of tension. For years, there's been data that shows if you use the levers of guilt, pity, or shame, it will bring dollars to the door. And nonprofits have been using that and as a justification for continuing to use poverty porn. And we all know that the third sector, civil society, nonprofits many are not endowed. We have to raise the money. So that's attention. We want to keep it light too. We want to invoke inspiration and awe and amusement while we're dealing with some really heavy issues, if you haven't noticed lately, right? We don't want to bore the audience, but we want to share enough information to be credible. And we want to show that there is urgency to mobilize people to take action. At the same time, as I just said prior, social change is a long-term prospect. So at the end of the day, at Thousand Currents, we want to emphasize the courage and self-determination of peoples. And for us, portraying inequality and structural drivers of poverty are really important to doing that. But that's where it gets really heady and boring. So that's why a lot of market-driven communications folks will default to what we call poverty porn. Next slide, please. So I just want to pause for a second and hear from folks in the room in Oakland, or the two folks in our chat box. What do you see as how do you recognize that something is poverty porn?
In my own organization, use it in marketing campaigns with the same justification that you mentioned, that it's how you bring the dollars in the door, and we kind of set that aside from issues of dismantling inequality systematically, and out of it. But seen it, on Instagram ads, Facebook ads, where we're like warring for people's attention, and we feel like we need to like catch them and jar them out of the complacency of like scrolling through social media streams. And again, the other excuse that we use that it needs to be visceral to get somebody to stop and engage with it.
Yeah, so you're absolutely experiencing that tension. Yep. Nye from Cambridge writes on the chat, for me, poverty porn tends to try and elicit an emotional response from potential donors. Just as you were saying there in Oakland, it tends to play into harmful tropes that objectify people. Yeah, I think that there's, as you were saying, the visceral, the definition I use is the practice of depicting the graphic qualities of a vulnerable human being for the sole purpose of eliciting an emotional experience and ultimately money. So there's three steps. There's betrayal, the emotional response, and then the action of giving, right? And the idea that those three things are super linked. I think assumptions and generalizations about who people are and what they need, and how those of us in wealthy countries can help them over there, that's been part of nonprofit and social good communications for decades. So, but it is definitely time that we take a step forward, and that's why I'm really glad you're all here. I think the other thing that I want to hold in all of this is just acknowledging that the real nature of poverty and disease and conflict and injustice is also tragic and heartbreaking. So we've seen it go from, really rough things like what I put on the screen there, to now like happy, fun, poor people. I've also seen that, which is also to me just as icky. Poverty is not devoid of stress. There's nothing uncomplicated or pure or moral about being poor. So I just want to hold that. And I think there's still this thing that we would just want people to have that empathetic response, but the fear is that doesn't drive donations. But we carry on. Okay, next slide, please. This is one of the most egregious ones I have ever encountered. Example-wise. Sorry, go back to the other one, Vero. Is that there we go, thank you. So really in our sector, we're looking at identityless, helpless, incapable, or desperate people. And this conjuring up victimhood and passivity is really there validating the assistance that's being given. So as we get more aware ourselves that these portrayals support these politicized notions of the other, we at Thousand Currents are really have a aim that we're trying for. It's that in our communication products, can all individuals, including those whose lives and images are being shared, can they see themselves as part of the solution? Do they recognize themselves as part of the future that they are building? Which is a very different thing than a subject that's being, portrayed, right? And And that's our goal, at least. So let's get into some of the complexities of that. So next slide, please. The two children. You can skip that one, I guess. Okay. So what we try to do is really think about storytelling as enabling people to try on another person's shoes, because we also know that if you just hear one story, it can actually lead to reinforced narrative frames and deepened ignorance if we are not challenging those underlying frames. So you'll see in this graphic, you've got the core messages, which was, remember, part of my daily job is to figure out our core messages. Inside of that are the stories we're telling. But outside of that, in the lime green frame, is narratives. And these are the core operating assumptions that are held by the dominant society. It impacts how any of us understand the world and make sense of information. And what we know as thousand currents is that consciously or unconsciously, narratives encourage certain interpretations of facts and discourage other interpretations. So as humans, as social beings, we want to have information that reinforces that what we think and feel is right. Because we all want the validation and the recognition, right? So I could be sitting on a very opposite end of my aunt on a political spectrum, and we could read the same story and have different interpretations of its true meaning. So that's also one of the things we have to sit with us and grapple with actively. For us at Thousand Currents, we really believing that the reinforcement of anything that's like us versus them, or the notion that at least I'm doing something for the poor orphans, or any white savior mentalities, can really override our key messages and lower people's expectations for our own impact. So part of communicating more truthfully and honestly about how social transformation occurs is also holding ourselves accountable to that. So let's go into an exercise. And I'm really glad we've got a couple people online and those of you there in Oakland. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take an example and give a couple minutes and give it a read, because we have the images of poverty porn, but we also have written word, which is also reinforcing stereotypes. So we're going to see an excerpt from a draft blog that was written by in an organization I used to work for. Was the policy analyst. She had been to Cote d'Ivoire. She's an MBA, and they were working on this big chocolate campaign that was trying to root out problems in the supply chain. And she was doing some research there in preparation for the campaign. And so a part of her checklist of things she had to do was write this blog, and the blog editor had to read it. So you'll see her version, the first draft, and then the editor's version right next to it. And in your small groups, we'll put some questions up and ask you to just talk about that a little bit. So let's take 2 minutes here to read. We'll just put it on the screen up there, and then we'll split into groups and have some discussion. Anybody in Oakland want to start out just sharing a little bit what your group said or shared?
We talked about, first of all, the kind of like the second narrative definitely had like a stronger role in like what best responsibility was, like talking about these are items in your market and it's U.S. that's importing rather than that like Cote d'Ivoire exporting stuff, but it's always enough. So I think like the kind of like ownership, or I don't know if I want to use blame, but like I think that there's like a definite shift in there. We talked about I think one of the in the fund they used the word like desperate to be
heard, and also this idea of like children in every corner, definitely perpetuating this kind of narrative that you know, women are just happy to be there, like to have this situation, like they're in this very, you know, not great situation. And the last thing I think that we talked about was it's kind of subtle, like when they described the cloths as like mesmerized, which I think that kind of goes into like exoticizing people in different countries. And even like just the fact that they like, used parentheses, like I have the word for the cloths in the first one, like it was just a super exotic term. And really it's not even that relevant, like to the narrative to display it in that way. I mean, a little bit of like colorful that's not like based on in the first one is a lot more you know kind of like as opposed to based on in the second one.
Yep, thank you. Anybody else have other things to add from the other group?
Yeah, so I'll share thing that we talked about, which is specificity, and we talked about both the positive and negative of being specific about where this is happening, the location, the being specific about who was unpaying, and like those specificity, and messaging. It also being tunable and listen of them describing the dress and being specific to describe it was exoticizing.
Great observation.
And then another thing we talked about is kind of like the order of which they describe the details. Like on both pieces, we have like the same core content. Like you talk about the women, and you talk about what's being exported, but it was like a reverse order in the second one, where they start off with talking about Cote d'Ivoire and the supply chain and focusing on that, and then describing the women and how, you know, they might be unhappy with certain the situation. So the focus is so much on like these desperate men. The focus is on the chocolate supply chain in this country and possibly, you know, what can be done about it.
Great. And we've got Nye online sharing. I found it interesting that in both examples, the writers seem to describe the interaction as being that of listening to these women, almost as if to describe it as granting audience. I thought that listening could just as easily been changed to learning. Great suggestion. I was the editor, guys, and stuck in that weird balanced place where I had to serve an organizational aim, which was all about the campaign, and in which the policy advisors, like the author of this, had much more power than me in the situation. You know, I shared as a really example of my own evolution, my own learning, and I absolutely, you guys have offered some really wonderful suggestions. I think the other thing that I want to point out about the second version is that it recognized better the U.S. and the reader as the end of the supply chain. It was actually it wasn't just the other women, the women who were farming. It was you, the consumer, and like sort of trying to say that you are connected and part of this. Poorly. I think I did rather poorly on that, but it's another thing that I was trying to add. So thank you for catching the specificity and how that was important to me. If you can't tell me the names of the people you spoke with, you can at least tell me where they're from, as just a means of, you know, offering some dignity in that case. Yeah, and I think so much of what was happening was a white savior aspect in that first version, which is a real reinforcement of powerlessness and power over, and a lot of dependency being reinforced as well. So yeah, I'm happy. I'm glad we got to kind of look at this example and think about these questions. So more questions for us to chew on together tonight. Do you think it's possible to tell compelling stories without some measure of oversimplifying or trivializing other people's realities? Why or why not? Well, let's see what everybody thinks on that. And these are just really questions I sit with all the time. How do we inspire action without eliciting pity, shame, or pity or shame? And can readers be angry without judgment and obliged without guilt? Okay. So to wrap us up tonight, I want to give you a little quick guide to sniffing out poverty porn. These are 5 questions to always be asking, whether it's content that you're producing or content that you are reading or viewing. The first one is, who is speaking? The second is, for whom? About what? For what purpose? And then you'll probably have a lot more to say about what's missing. Or at least you can get curious about what might be missing. So if the purpose is fundraising, that might mean that it's a very quick formula, which many nonprofits use, which is so-and-so's poor, so-and-so got this thing from us, and now there's no problem anymore. It's just, that's not just a trope, it's a formula that's being used. So these set of questions I always always have in the back of my mind. And I think it can be really useful for anybody who is frankly consuming stuff from nonprofits or producing it. At Thousand Currents, we've got four principles around this that we try to think about in terms of how we tell stories. And we are humbly before you saying we don't have the answers. We have goals and things we want to do and want to keep doing better. But these are the things we think about. The first is that outsiders are never the antagonists of the story. And from our point of view, history is pretty unequivocal on that. In terms of when it comes to lasting social transformation, it is people's movements that bring that about. So then how can we really ensure that, oh my gosh, Beto was just telling me, it's protagonists. Outsiders are never the protagonists. Sorry, everybody. Misspoke. Thank you, Beto. The second is that we don't endorse simple solutions. We want to tell stories that help us consider the root causes and really stories that offer a lot of context and dignity. We really want stories that also stimulate critical thinking and compassion. We don't want to leave the compassion behind because that's still part of what we're trying to do. It helps us be connected to each other. Our stories are formed also with a global audience in mind. And so our partners, the people that we fund and walk with, are absolutely reading our content, right? Again, that's what we said about we want people to see themselves in it. But at the same time, we don't want, my 88-year-old grandma or the 8th grader who reads this. There shouldn't be a dumbing down. We respect our audiences enough to invite them to reflect on what are deeply rooted issues. When we don't do that, then content becomes transactional. And it's like, oh, hi donor, give us money. We're going to give you this thing so you give us money. And it becomes, extractive unto itself. And we don't want to do that. And finally, we try in our communications to always mobilize collective action. We're not just delivering information to targets in transactional ways. We are rather trying to weave an interdependent community that includes online and offline and everybody in between. So thank you, everybody. There's a lot more to say. There's a lot more to discuss, and we wanted to leave a little time open to see if there's any questions you all had before we go, and you guys can have more happy hour.